The hum of the jet engines was a constant, low vibration that you could feel in your teeth, a reminder that 30,000 feet of empty air separated the passengers from the ground below. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and stale coffee. It was that specific, heavy scent of money and tired people. The windows were small, framing patches of perfectly clear blue sky, without a single cloud to break the color. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, where everyone is trying very hard not to look at anyone else, maintaining the fragile bubble of personal space in a crowded metal tube. In the seat by the window, right at the front of the section, sat a man who looked like he didn't belong in the expensive leather chair. He was wearing a simple, dark jacket that had seen better days. The fabric was worn at the cuffs, and one of the zippers looked like it was stuck halfway. He had on a pair of jeans that were faded and comfortable, not the stylish kind of faded that costs a fortune at a boutique, but the kind that comes from years of being worn and washed. His boots were scuffed, laced up tight and practical. This was Keanu Reeves, but to the other people boarding the plane, he just looked like a guy trying to disappear. He was hunched forward slightly, his shoulders curved inward as if he was trying to make himself smaller. He had a thick paperback book in his hands, his thumb holding his place about halfway through. His eyes moved across the lines, focused and intense, completely shutting out the world around him. Every time a passenger walked down the aisle to find their seat, he didn't look up. He didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want to be the famous actor right now. He just wanted to be a man traveling from one place to another, hoping to get through the flight without a fuss. A few rows back, on the opposite side of the aisle, the atmosphere was completely different. A man in a sharp, tailored suit was settling into his seat. He made sure everyone saw him as he tossed a leather briefcase onto the empty seat next to him with a loud thud. He pulled out his phone immediately, pressing it to his ear. He was a man who seemed to believe that volume was the same thing as importance. "Yeah, the numbers are looking good," he barked into the phone, his voice cutting through the low murmurs of the cabin like a siren. "I told them we need to close the deal before Friday. I don't care about their excuses. If they can't handle the pressure, find someone else who can." He laughed, a loud barking sound that made a few other passengers wince and adjust their headphones. He was dressed to impress, with a gold watch glinting on his wrist and cufflinks that caught the harsh overhead lighting. He smoothed his tie, looking around the cabin with a smug satisfaction, as if he owned the plane and everyone in it was just a guest in his world. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, offering pre-flight drinks. When they got to the loud man, he didn't even look at them. He just held up a hand to wave them away while continuing his loud conversation about millions of dollars and leverage. When they got to Keanu, however, the dynamic shifted. Keanu looked up, closing his book for a second. He smiled, a tired but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Just water, please," he said softly. "And thank you for asking." "Of course, sir," the attendant replied, her posture relaxing noticeably as she moved away to get his water. The businessman finally ended his call, shoving the phone into his pocket with a sigh of exaggerated impatience. He looked around, bored now that he wasn't talking about money. His eyes scanned the cabin looking for something, or someone, to focus on. They landed on the man in the worn jacket by the window. The businessman squinted, leaning forward slightly. The face looked familiar. It was a face he had seen on screens in big living rooms, usually fighting bad guys or saving the world in slow motion. A smirk played on the businessman's lips. It wasn't a smile of admiration. It was the smile of a predator spotting something weaker, something he could poke at to entertain himself. He saw a famous movie star sitting there in clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store, looking tired and quiet. To the businessman, this wasn't humility. It looked like a fall from grace. It looked like a joke. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and walked to the front of the cabin. He didn't need to use the restroom, he just wanted an audience. He stopped in the aisle right next to Keanu's row, blocking the flow of traffic slightly. He looked down at the actor, who was trying to go back to his book. "Hey," the businessman said, his voice loud enough for the people in the rows around them to hear. "Aren't you that guy, the movie star?" Keanu paused. He took a slow breath, his hand tightening slightly on the spine of his book. He looked up, his expression guarded but polite. He didn't want a scene, he just wanted to read. He nodded once, a small, minimal movement. "Yeah, that's me." The businessman let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He looked at the other passengers as if asking them to share in the joke. "Wow. I didn't realize they let you fly in the front anymore," he sneered. "What happened? Did you lose all your money? You look like you're on your way to a job interview at a gas station." Keanu didn't flinch. He watched the man with a calm, steady gaze. There was no flash of anger in his eyes, which seemed to annoy the businessman even more. The man in the suit was used to getting a reaction, usually fear or submission. He wanted to see the actor crack. "I mean, seriously," the businessman continued, his voice rising a notch. He gestured at Keanu's clothes with a look of disgust. "Look at this jacket. I have cleaning rags that look better than this. I thought you guys were supposed to be rich. Is the action hero business not paying the bills these days?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman across the aisle looked down at her magazine, wishing she was anywhere else. The air in the cabin, previously just heavy with quiet, now felt thick with tension. It was that awful, sinking feeling you get when someone is being cruel in public, and you know there is nothing you can do to stop it without making it worse. Keanu looked at the man. He thought about his life, the things he had been through, the loss he had endured, and the millions he had given away to charity because he knew money wasn't what mattered. He looked at the man's expensive shoes and the hard, empty look in his eyes. He realized that this man didn't know him. This man only knew the image of a movie star, and he was angry because that image didn't match the tired human being sitting in the chair. Instead of shouting back, instead of using his status to humiliate the man in return, Keanu simply closed his book. He placed it gently on his lap. He looked the businessman right in the eye, his face completely open. There was a sadness in his expression, not for himself, but for the man standing in front of him. "I'm just happy to be on the plane," Keanu said quietly. His voice was so soft that the businessman had to lean in to hear him. "I hope you have a good flight." Then Keanu turned his head back toward the window. He ended the conversation. He dismissed the bully not with words, but with a total lack of interest. He looked out at the blue sky, leaving the businessman standing alone in the aisle with his mouth half open, unsure of what to do next. The silence that followed was louder than the businessman's shouting had been. It was the silence of a man who had tried to punch a ghost and hit only air. The silence that followed Keanu's quiet dismissal hung in the air like thick smoke. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against your ears. The businessman stood in the aisle for a moment longer, his face turning a shade darker as the realization set in. He had tried to poke the bear, but the bear hadn't roared. The bear had just looked at him with pity and turned away. For a man who fed on attention and dominance, being ignored was worse than being shouted at. It made him feel small, and he hated feeling small. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, jagged sound that was meant to show everyone that he wasn't bothered. He flopped back into his seat, the leather cushions squeaking under his weight. He didn't look at his phone this time. He looked straight at the back of Keanu's head. The calmness of the actor, the way he just stared out at the wing of the plane cutting through the clouds, seemed to infuriate him. It was a challenge. "Unbelievable," the businessman muttered, just loud enough for the people in the seats in front of him to hear. "Some people have no respect. They think just because they were in a few movies 20 years ago, they don't have to talk to regular folks." The man sitting next to the businessman, a tired older guy wearing a baseball cap, shifted uncomfortably. He clearly wanted to disappear into his seat. He pulled his newspaper up higher, trying to create a wall between himself and the drama unfolding next to him. But the businessman wasn't looking for a conversation with his seatmate. He was performing for an audience, and his main target was still that quiet figure in the worn jacket. "Hey, Hollywood," the businessman barked out. He didn't stand up this time, but he leaned forward, his body extending into the aisle, pointing a finger at Keanu's back. "I'm talking to you." "Don't be rude." Keanu slowly turned his head. His movements were deliberate and slow, like he was measuring out his patience. He didn't look angry. He looked more like a teacher waiting for a student to settle down. He didn't say anything, just watched the man with those dark, observant eyes. This lack of verbal response was like gasoline on a fire. The businessman's face twisted into a sneer. He leaned back, throwing his hands up in exaggeration. "Look at him," the businessman said to the cabin at large, his voice booming off the closed overhead bins. The great action hero. He can dodge bullets on screen, I guess, but he can't handle a simple conversation in real life. A few rows back, a young mother traveling with a toddler looked worried. She put a hand on her child's shoulder, as if to shield him from the noise and the negativity in the air. The tension in the first-class cabin was tight enough to snap. Everyone was awake now. Everyone was watching. You could feel the collective cringe of the passengers. It was that specific second-hand embarrassment you feel when someone is making a fool of themselves in public, but they are too arrogant to realize it. "I bet you're not even reading that book," the businessman continued, his tone mocking and cruel. "I bet you're just sitting there pretending to be smart so nobody bothers you. What is it? A script? Trying to memorize lines because you forgot how to act?" He laughed at his own joke, a dry, humorless sound. When nobody else joined in, his smile faltered for a split second, but then he doubled down. "You know, I saw your last movie." He lied, or maybe he didn't, but his voice dripped with judgment. "It was terrible, absolute garbage. I almost walked out, but I guess you need the paycheck, right? Is that why you're dressed like a homeless guy? Did you blow all your cash on bad investments?" Keanu let out a very small sigh. It wasn't a sigh of annoyance, but of resignation. He placed his hand on the cover of his book, his fingers tracing the edge of the paperback. He looked at the businessman, really looked at him, and for a second the actor's guard dropped. You could see the weariness in his face. This was a man who had faced incredible tragedy in his life, who had lost people he loved more than anything in the world. Being mocked for his clothes or his career by a stranger in a suit seemed trivial to him. It was just noise. But the businessman didn't see the depth of the man he was attacking. He only saw a surface he could scratch. "I asked you a question," the businessman snapped, his voice losing the playful mocking tone and taking on a harder, sharper edge. "Are you broke? Is that it? Do you need me to lend you a 20 for a sandwich when we land?" A passenger in the row across from them, a woman in a business suit, shook her head slightly. She looked at the businessman with clear disgust, her eyes narrowing. She opened her mouth as if to say something, to tell him to leave the man alone, but she stopped herself. She didn't want to get dragged into it. She didn't want to be the next target. Keanu decided to try one more time to de-escalate the situation. He didn't want the flight to be like this for hours. He didn't want the other passengers to suffer through this man's ego. "I'm doing fine, thank you," Keanu said. His voice was calm, steady, and clear. "I'm just trying to read. I'd appreciate it if we could both have a quiet flight." "Quiet?" The businessman laughed, slamming his hand down on the armrest. The sound made the woman next to him jump. "You think you can tell me what to do? I paid for this seat. I paid for the quiet too, and I'll talk as much as I want. You aren't the boss of me, movie star." He leaned forward again, getting right into Keanu's space. The smell of expensive alcohol on his breath drifted over the aisle. "You think you're tough?" he whispered loudly, a menacing growl in his voice. "I've seen guys like you, all talk when there's a camera rolling, but when it's real life, you've got nothing. You're soft, you're weak, you're sitting there like a scared little boy because a real man is talking to you." The insult hung there, ugly and raw. The cabin was dead silent now. Even the flight attendants, who were busy preparing for takeoff at the back of the plane, stopped what they were doing to glance forward. They sensed the shift. It wasn't just annoying anymore, it was aggressive. Keanu didn't move, he didn't defend himself, he didn't list his accomplishments. He didn't point out that he had probably done more charity work in the last year than this businessman would do in his lifetime. He just sat there taking it, absorbing the negativity so it wouldn't spread to anyone else. The businessman took Keanu's silence as fear. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, looking around the cabin as if he had just won a prize fight. "Yeah, that's what I thought," he sneered, looking at Keanu with pure disdain. "Nothing to say, no clever lines, no witty comeback. It's funny, isn't it? They give you a script in the movies, they tell you exactly what to say and how to be a hero. But take away the script, take away the directors and the stunt doubles, and you're just a guy in a dirty jacket who doesn't have a voice. Guess the action hero isn't so tough without a script, huh?" He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes with a smug satisfaction, convinced he had won. He had humiliated the celebrity. He had shown the whole plane who was really in charge. But as he sat there, basking in his own cruelty, he failed to notice the looks the other passengers were giving him. They weren't looks of admiration. They were looks of pure loathing. He had won the argument in his own mind, but in the real world, he had just made a complete fool of himself. And the reckoning for his behavior was closer than he thought. The plane taxied away from the gate, the huge machine turning slowly on the tarmac. The sun was bright outside, bouncing off the tarmac, but inside the first-class cabin, the mood had turned cloudy and gray. The businessman sat with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk still plastered on his face. He truly believed he had won. In his mind, he had dominated the conversation, shown everyone who was in charge, and put the celebrity in his place. He looked around the cabin, expecting to see nods of approval or smiles of agreement from the other passengers. Instead, he was met with cold shoulders and averted eyes. The man in the baseball cap across the aisle had put on noise-canceling headphones and was staring resolutely at the seat back in front of him. The woman in the business suit was typing furiously on her laptop, her lips pressed into a thin line. The young mother was whispering to her child, distracting him from the tension in the air. The businessman didn't understand it. He was used to people respecting power, or at least fearing it. He didn't realize that there is a big difference between fear and respect, and right now, nobody respected him. As the plane leveled off and the captain turned off the seatbelt sign with a chime, the crew began to move. A flight attendant pushed the heavy metal drink cart down the narrow aisle. She was a woman with kind eyes and a tired but professional smile. She had seen everything on flights: drunks, fighters, crying babies, and sick passengers. She knew how to read a room, and as she approached the front rows, she could feel the tension radiating off the passengers like heat from a fire. She stopped the cart next to the businessman's row. She didn't look at him with the admiration he thought he deserved. She looked at him as a task to be completed. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" she asked. Her voice was polite, but it was flat. It was the voice you use when you are reading from a script and just want to get to the end of the page. The businessman didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, still fuming from the lack of reaction he had gotten earlier. "Yeah," he snapped. "Scotch, neat, and make it a double. Don't water it down." "Certainly, sir," she said, turning to reach for a glass. "And bring some nuts," he added, finally glancing at her with a look of impatience. "I'm hungry." "Don't make me wait all day." She didn't respond to the tone. She simply poured the drink with a steady hand and placed it on his tray table with a napkin. "Here you are, sir. I'll get those nuts for you." She left his row and pushed the cart forward just one step to where Keanu was sitting. The change in her demeanor was instant and electric. It wasn't about him being famous, it was about how he treated people. Her face softened, the professional mask slipping away to reveal genuine warmth. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly. "It is so good to see you again." Keanu looked up, his face breaking into that familiar, humble smile. The exhaustion seemed to lift from his shoulders the moment he spoke to her. "Hello," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly warmth. "It's good to see you too. How have you been?" "I've been well, thank you for asking," she replied, leaning in slightly. "I actually wanted to thank you. Do you remember flying with us about 6 months ago? The red-eye from New York?" Keanu thought for a second, nodding slowly. "I think so." "It was a busy flight." "It was," she said. "But I remember you stayed back after the landing to help us pick up the blankets. You didn't have to do that. And you asked me about my son, the one who was applying to college. You really listened." Keanu shrugged, looking down at his hands. "I remember. How is he doing?" "Did he get in?" "He did," she said, her voice bright with happiness. "He starts in the fall. He's studying engineering just like he wanted. You made a huge impression on him when I told him you asked about him. It made him feel special." "He's the one doing the hard work," Keanu said sincerely. "You should be proud." "That's wonderful news, really." The contrast between the two rows could not have been more stark. On one side, a man in a $5,000 suit who treated everyone like they were invisible servants. On the other side, a man in a worn jacket who remembered a flight attendant's son 6 months later. The cabin was silent again, but this time it wasn't a tense silence. It was a silence of respect. People were leaning in, listening to the kindness in Keanu's voice. Even the businessman had stopped sipping his scotch. He was listening too, a frown creasing his forehead. The flight attendant turned to get Keanu's water. "And I heard about what you did for the hospital downtown last week," she continued, keeping her voice low but respectful. "My sister works there. She said you came in without any cameras, without any press, just visited the kids and brought toys. She said you made a little girl laugh who hadn't smiled in weeks." Keanu looked uncomfortable with the praise. He waved his hand gently. "I just wanted to help. They are brave kids. Tougher than I am." "You are a good man, Mr. Reeves," she said, placing a bottle of water on his tray. "It's an honor to have you on board." "Thank you," Keanu said simply. "And thank you for taking care of us. You guys work hard, I see it." The interaction was short, but it shifted the gravity of the entire plane. The businessman suddenly felt very small. He looked at his scotch, then at his reflection in the dark window. He tried to tell himself that the actor was just faking it, that it was all an act, but it didn't feel like an act. It felt real. It was clear that this flight attendant loved the man in the worn jacket, while she barely tolerated the man in the suit. The jealousy burned in the businessman's chest. It was an ugly, green feeling. He didn't understand why people loved this actor so much. He saw the world as a hierarchy of money and power. Keanu had money, sure, but he wasn't using it to command the room. He was using his kindness. To the businessman, kindness was a weakness. But right now, looking at the smiling flight attendant and the respectful nods of the other passengers, he realized that his strength was actually making him weak. He was isolated. He couldn't let it stand. He couldn't let this movie star win the room just by being nice. "Excuse me," the businessman barked out, slamming his hand on the call button. The sound was sharp and aggressive, shattering the warm moment. "Hello, can I get those nuts? Or are you too busy chatting with the celebrities to do your job?" The flight attendant froze. She turned around slowly. The warmth was gone from her face now, replaced by a cold, professional stare. She looked at the businessman with a look that could have frozen water. It was the kind of look that said she saw right through him. She saw the insecurity, the loneliness, and the spite. "I heard you the first time, sir," she said, her voice icy and calm. She didn't apologize. She didn't rush. She walked over to the cart, picked up a small bag of nuts, and placed it on his tray with a deliberate, slow movement. "Here are your nuts." She didn't say, "Enjoy your flight." She didn't say, "Let me know if you need anything else." She just turned her back on him and walked away to check on the other passengers. The businessman sat there holding his glass of scotch. His hand was shaking slightly. He looked around. No one was looking at him with admiration. The man in the baseball cap was shaking his head. The woman with the laptop actually let out a quiet sigh of disgust. Even the teenager a few rows back was looking at him like he was a villain in a movie. He took a big gulp of his drink, the liquid burning his throat. He tried to tell himself that they were all wrong, that he was the successful one. But as he sat there, surrounded by luxury and comfort, he had never felt so poor in his entire life. The plastic bag of peanuts sat on the tray table, unopened. The businessman stared at it, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the armrest. The silence that filled the first-class cabin was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of people resting. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment. He could feel it pressing down on him. It made his skin feel hot and tight, especially around his collar. He took a sip of his scotch, the ice clinking softly against the glass. The liquid burned, but it didn't wash away the bitter taste in his mouth. He looked to his left, at the older man in the baseball cap. The man was turned all the way toward the window, his body language screaming a message. "I do not want to talk to you." "Rude service, huh?" the businessman said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow and fake. He was desperate for someone to agree with him, to validate that he was the victim in this situation. "You pay all this money for first class, and they ignore you because some celebrity is on board. It's unprofessional." The older man didn't turn his head. He didn't say a word. He just adjusted his headphones, signaling that the conversation was over before it had even begun. The businessman sat back, his jaw clenching tight. He looked around the cabin again. The woman across the aisle was still typing on her laptop, but he could see her eyes flick up toward him every few seconds. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him like he was something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her shoe. Even the teenager a few rows back, who had been playing a video game, had paused. The kid was looking over the seat, staring at the businessman with a look of open disdain. It was a strange and terrifying feeling for the man. He spent his life walking into boardrooms and shouting orders, watching people scramble to please him. He was used to being the alpha, the one in control. But here, in this confined space 30,000 feet in the air, his money meant nothing. His suit meant nothing. His title meant nothing. The only currency that mattered here was kindness, and he was completely broke. He looked back at Keanu. The actor had gone back to his book, seemingly unaffected by the drama that had just unfolded. He was turning a page, his movements gentle and calm. Every now and then, he would take a sip of water or look out the window at the endless blue sky. He possessed a stillness that the businessman couldn't understand. It was as if Keanu was carrying a portable peace around with him, a wall that no amount of noise or insults could break. Suddenly, a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, appeared in the aisle. He had snuck away from his mother in the economy section and wandered up to see the big seats. He stopped right next to Keanu's row, his eyes wide with excitement. He was holding a small piece of paper and a pen. The businessman watched, waiting. He thought, here we go, another interruption. The actor is going to get annoyed now. Keanu looked up and saw the boy. He didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't point to his book and say he was busy. Instead, he immediately closed the book and set it down. He smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Hi there," Keanu said softly. "Hi," the boy whispered, suddenly shy. Can I have your autograph, please?" "Absolutely," Keanu said. He took the paper and pen, but he didn't just sign his name and hand it back. He leaned in closer to the boy. "What's your name?" "Liam," the boy said. "Nice to meet you, Liam," Keanu said, writing the name down. "Are you having a good flight?" "Yeah," Liam said, smiling from ear to ear. "I'm going to see my grandma." "That's great. Grandmas are the best," Keanu said. He handed the paper back. "You take care of your mom on the trip, okay? Be a good co-pilot." "I will," Liam promised. He clutched the paper like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Thank you. You're welcome," Keanu said. He gave the boy a small wave as he turned and ran back down the aisle to find his mother. The businessman watched the entire interaction. He saw the way the boy's face lit up. He saw the genuine care in Keanu's voice. It wasn't a PR stunt. There were no cameras, no one was clapping. It was just a human being kind to another human being, for no other reason than that it was the right thing to do. And then, the businessman realized something that made his stomach drop. The boy hadn't even looked at him. The kid had walked right past the man in the expensive suit, past the gold watch and the leather shoes, to get to the guy in the worn jacket. In the eyes of that child, and in the eyes of everyone else on the plane, the businessman was invisible. Or worse, he was a villain. The shame hit him like a physical blow. It started in his chest and spread out to his limbs, making his hands feel heavy and clumsy. He looked at the reflection of his face in the dark window. He saw the anger, the arrogance, and the loneliness. For the first time in a long time, he didn't like what he saw. He tried to convince himself that he didn't care. So what, he thought. I have money, I have success. I don't need to be liked by a bunch of strangers on a plane. But the thought felt hollow. Success wasn't just about the numbers in a bank account. He realized with a sinking feeling that respect was something you couldn't buy. You had to earn it, and he had just spent the last hour doing the exact opposite. He wanted to stand up and say something. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to tell Keanu that he was sorry, that he didn't know why he was being so mean, that he was just tired and stressed. The words were right there on the tip of his tongue. He opened his mouth slightly, turning toward the aisle. "Mr. Reeves," he started to say, his voice barely a croak. But the words caught in his throat. They felt like stones. He couldn't get them out. His ego was holding them back, choking him. To apologize would be to admit defeat. It would be to admit that the man in the worn jacket was better than him, and he wasn't ready to do that yet, so he closed his mouth. He swallowed hard, the taste of scotch and regret mixing together in a sour combination. He slumped down deeper into his seat, pulling his tie loose as if it was strangling him. The cabin lights were dimmed now as the plane cruised through the night sky. Most of the passengers had closed their eyes to sleep. The flight attendants were gathered at the back, speaking in low whispers. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic hum of the engines. The businessman sat there in the dark, alone with his thoughts. He watched Keanu out of the corner of his eye. The actor had fallen asleep, his head resting gently against the side of the cabin, his breathing slow and even. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man without a heavy weight on his shoulders. The businessman, on the other hand, felt crushed. He was surrounded by luxury, sitting in the most expensive seat on the plane, but he had never felt poorer. He looked at the glass of scotch in his hand and suddenly didn't want it. He set it down on the tray with a clatter. He looked around at the sleeping faces of the strangers who hated him. He realized that tomorrow this flight would be over. He would go to his meetings, and he would make his deals, and he would go back to his life. But he knew, deep down, that he would remember this moment. He would remember the silence. He would remember the look in the flight attendant's eyes. He would remember the smile on the little boy's face. He closed his own eyes, but he couldn't find any peace. The regret was instant, and it was total. He had tried to tear someone else down to make himself feel big, but he had only succeeded in making himself feel incredibly small. And there was no one to blame but the man staring back at him in the dark window. The voice of the captain crackled over the speakers, announcing that the plane had begun its descent. The fastened seatbelt sign chimed on with that familiar asterisk ding, echoing through the cabin like a school bell signaling the end of a difficult day. Outside the small windows, the city below was beginning to glow, a vast grid of orange and white lights spreading out into the darkness. It looked peaceful from up there, organized and perfect. Inside the plane, the mood remained heavy. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, his seatbelt pulled tight across his lap. He hadn't moved for over an hour. He had just sat there, staring at the back of the seat in front of him, his mind racing with thoughts that made him uncomfortable. He kept replaying the scene with the flight attendant and the little boy. He saw the disgust in the woman's eyes and the disappointment in the older man's face. He felt like he had been on trial, and the verdict had been delivered without a single word being spoken against him. As the wheels of the plane hit the tarmac with a screech and a thud, the cabin shuddered. The engines roared in reverse as the plane slowed, taxiing toward the gate. The businessman felt a surge of anxiety. He wasn't worried about his meeting or his luggage. He was worried about walking out that door. He didn't want to stand up and face the people he had mistreated. He didn't want to see the look on Keanu's face again. When the plane finally came to a stop and the captain turned off the seatbelt sign, the usual chaos began. The sound of seatbelts clicking open was like gunfire in the quiet cabin. People stood up, stretching their limbs and reaching for the overhead bins. The businessman hesitated. He wanted to be the last one off. He wanted to wait until the cabin was empty so he wouldn't have to pass anyone. But then he saw Keanu stand up. The actor didn't rush. He took his time, placing his paperback book into his worn backpack. He zipped it up, the same stuck zipper that had been there before, and slung the bag over one shoulder. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly slumped, but there was a calmness about him that hadn't changed. He checked the pocket of his jacket to make sure he had his phone and his wallet, simple human habits that everyone shares. Keanu stepped into the aisle. He was directly across from the businessman's row. The businessman looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, time seemed to stop. The businessman's heart hammered against his ribs. He saw his own terrified reflection in Keanu's dark eyes. He waited for the actor to say something cutting. He waited for a glare. He expected Keanu to treat him with the same disdain he had shown earlier. But Keanu didn't look away. He didn't sneer. He didn't look down at the businessman with superiority. He just looked at him. It was a look of deep, quiet understanding. It was the kind of look you give someone when you know they are hurting, even if they are trying to hide it behind a wall of anger. Keanu paused in the aisle. He wasn't blocking the way on purpose. He was just taking a moment. The businessman felt his face burning hot. His throat went dry. He knew he should say something. He knew this was his last chance to fix it, to stop being the villain in this story. The businessman started. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to find the deep, commanding voice he used in boardrooms, but it wouldn't come. I'm sorry. The words were barely a whisper. They were pathetic and weak, but they were honest. Keanu heard them. He nodded his head once, a slow, gentle nod. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't say, I accept your apology, or it's okay that you were a jerk. He just let the words hang there, acknowledging them without judgment. It's a long flight, Keanu said softly. His voice was kind, devoid of any sarcasm. It makes everyone tired. It gets to you? He offered a small, sympathetic smile, as if the businessman's bad behavior was just a symptom of a bad day rather than a character flaw. Then Keanu adjusted the strap of his bag. "Safe travels," Keanu said. He turned and began to walk down the aisle toward the front exit. The businessman sat there, stunned. He watched Keanu move away. As the actor walked past the other passengers, the atmosphere changed completely. The tired mother looked up and smiled at him. The man in the baseball cap reached out to shake his hand. Keanu stopped, shook the hand, and said a few quiet words. He laughed at something the older man said. It was a genuine, happy sound. Even the flight attendant at the front door beamed at him, wishing him a wonderful evening as he stepped out of the plane and into the jet bridge. He disappeared into the tunnel, just another person leaving the airport, leaving behind a trail of warmth that the businessman had tried to extinguish but failed. The cabin was nearly empty now. The businessman was the only one left in his section. He stood up slowly. His legs felt shaky. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, but it felt heavier than usual. He straightened his tie and put on his suit jacket, trying to put his armor back on. But it didn't fit the same way anymore. It felt like a costume. He walked down the aisle. The flight attendant was standing by the door, waiting for the last passengers to leave. She looked at him. Her expression was neutral, professional, but her eyes were cold. "Have a good evening, sir," she said. The words were polite, but they were empty. They were just sounds she was paid to make. "Thank you," the businessman mumbled. He couldn't look her in the eye. He walked out of the plane and into the busy airport terminal. The noise was overwhelming. People shouting, carts rolling, televisions blaring announcements. He walked toward the baggage claim, surrounded by hundreds of people. He had thousands of dollars in his pocket. He had a reservation at a five-star hotel. He had a meeting that would earn him millions. But as he walked through the crowd, nobody looked at him with respect. Nobody smiled at him. He was just another face in the crowd, an angry man in a suit who looked like he was in a hurry to get nowhere. He thought about Keanu. He thought about the worn jacket and the stuck zipper. He realized that true wealth wasn't about the money you spent on a first-class ticket. It wasn't about how loud you could talk or how expensive your watch was. Real wealth was about what was inside you. It was about the kindness you could give to a stranger, even when that stranger was being cruel. Keanu had everything he needed right there in his heart. The businessman, with all his possessions, had nothing but a hollow feeling in his chest. He reached the baggage carousel and stood among the waiting crowd. He watched the black bags circling around on the metal rollers. For the first time in years, he didn't push to the front. He didn't complain about the wait. He just stood there, quiet and alone, thinking about the man who had shown him that being the strongest person in the room doesn't mean you have to be the loudest. The businessman grabbed his bag and turned toward the exit. The automatic glass doors slid open, letting in the cool night air of the city. He walked out into the darkness, carrying the weight of his regret, knowing that he would remember this flight for the rest of his life. And he hoped, somewhere deep down, that the next time he saw someone who looked tired or different, he would be a little more like the man in the window seat, and a lot less like the man he used to be.